Our fellow teacher, Caroline Strawson, is back with us today to talk about how childhood trauma affects you as an adult. Caroline is a multi-award-winning trauma-informed therapist and coach and #1 best-selling author. Welcome back to AVAIYA, Caroline.
Thank you. It's so good to be here again. I always love helping all of your community. They're amazing.
Well, thank you so much for coming back and doing that with us today. So let's talk childhood trauma. In your experience, I know that a lot of your work surrounds, narcissistic abuse and trauma. What is childhood trauma to you?
Well, I think, the whole word trauma, we kind of start to think about in our childhood things about if there's sexual abuse, neglect, and of course that is trauma. And these are major events that happen in a child's life. But trauma is very individual and it comes in many formats. And I think this is where we start to see a lot of shame and blame and guilt and judgment in our society today, where we almost see it as a spectrum of, if obviously a child has been abused, that's horrendous. But then if somebody else feels like, well, you know what, I thought I had an all right childhood, but I still seem stuck as an adult. Maybe I didn't have childhood trauma. And, trauma in any format is so individual and it can be micro events even. And trauma isn't necessarily about a specific event. It's about what you're saying to yourself and what that gets locked in the body as a traumatic memory, literally deep in your fascia, right in your nervous system, about what those events are. That then leads to what I call these inner child wounds. And so these inner child wounds can be anything from things like I'm not good enough, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable, I'm not important. And how our system is driven then is to move away from pain. Sadly, as adults, we're not driven for success and wealth and happiness. We have to be intentional for that. Actually, our structure as a human being is survival, safety, and to be in the least amount of pain. So again, I'm sure many of the listeners are thinking, well, hold on, Caroline, I'm in pain right now. But the system will think, your inner system will think it's less painful than something else. So really for me, when I think about childhood trauma, these are about your interpretations, your perceptions of things in the moment as that child that creates this inner child wound. And your system kind of goes, oh, this is so painful feeling like this. Don't ever want to feel like this again. So then all of these protector parts start just to show up. So I do a lot of internal family systems in what I do. So those protector parts, and again, from my perspective, Andy, my kind of inner child wound was I didn't feel good enough. And that wasn't necessarily, I'd always thought I'd had a great childhood. It was only then when I went into a narcissistic marriage and came out and did a lot of my own inner work, I really then started to explore my own childhood and why I ended up in that kind of relationship and what was going on without the shame, although I did feel a lot of shame at the time. And I realized that I didn't necessarily have abuse or neglect or anything like that. But my dad was really, really unemotional. So, if I did really well at something, I'd never, ever get, oh, wow, Caroline, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. Or I really love you. I never really heard that from my father. And as a kid, not receiving that from my dad, my interpretation of that was, I'm not good enough. So I would then have that inner child wound of I'm not good enough because it was painful then. And I would have protector parts for me with things like people pleasing, perfectionism, high achieving. So I was this child getting straight A's and being captain of the sports team and being this good girl, doing nothing wrong ever. When I look back, I think, oh my God, I was like, my sisters used to take the mickey out of me. I was that good. As well. But that wasn't coming from a place of self-leadership. It was actually coming from a place of that expectation and needing that approval and validation from my father to minimize that inner child wound. So I just want to be really clear to all the listeners, of course, any form of child abuse or neglect absolutely is a traumatic event. But for those listeners who may be thinking, well, that didn't happen to me, but feeling stuck as an adult, I want them to know that trauma comes in all formats. It's what you're saying to yourself about those events. And they can be massive events or they can be micro events and lots of little things as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And those different parts that you mentioned, right? People pleasing, perfectionism, right? High achieving. I'm like, oh, I so relate to all of that, right? Like I'm sure a lot of people do in the audience listening right now. And so, okay, so we have, whether people watching or listening had these micro events or whether they had, big T traumas, really horrific things happen, sexual abuse, those kinds of things in their life. Why do you think it's so hard for people to heal after childhood trauma specifically?
I think what happens in our childhood, and this is really particularly between the ages of 2 and 7, where we're kind of in this theta brainwave state, and this is where our beliefs about ourselves are really formed. You know, as we come into this world, we all have that essence of who we are, that true self, that kind of baby child who is filled with confidence and curiosity. And actually then it's our perception of those events that happen to us, depending on what they are, that starts to bring up those parts for us. But what happens is it gets locked inside our body. You know, our nervous system very much is the driver of our lived experiences. And, you know, this should be taught in schools at the end of the day. You know, we get taught all about our reproductive system and how we operate like that, but we don't get taught about why we feel the way that we do. And if we did, we'd release a lot of shame and guilt that we feel as adults in particular. But it's so difficult to heal from childhood trauma, because so many times when we're trying to heal from childhood trauma, we're really only accessing the front part of our brain, the neocortex, which is our thinking brain. And you can't think your way out of childhood trauma, you know, however much. And don't get me wrong, there are still, you know, it's still great to do affirmations and say all of these wonderful things, because the brain does work on familiarity and repetition too. But when we have that childhood trauma that is literally locked in our body, like I said, deep in our fascia, we have to access different parts of the brain. We have to have a really embodied somatic approach to all of that. And whilst, yes, it's really important to look at managing those symptoms, and this is where things like CBT come in, you know, where we're looking at ways of managing how we are behaving. But to really get to that root cause and really, really understand, we have to work in the body. We've got to access where our hippocampus is, which is our long-term memory center, the amygdala, which is our fear center, and that's in what we call our limbic system. And we need to be able to access all of that to almost timestamp those events into the past that is in our past as childhood, as opposed to keep reliving them in the present as an adult. Because if you imagine, if we have that, and again, I'll use me as an example because it's just easier and hopefully people, the listeners, can relate. So for me, having that childhood wound of I'm not good enough, no matter what I was doing as I got older and reading the self-help books and really working on myself and saying I am good enough, every time someone behaved or acted in a way that potentially could trigger me of feeling not good enough, I would have all of these parts showing up. So as adults, it moved into things like emotional eating protector part, self-harm protector part. So other parts started to come in to try and protect me in those roles, to try and distract or soothe me away from feeling not good enough, because that for my system was still the most pain to feel. So yes, externally, you could think, well, self-harming isn't a good place to be. But my self-harming part had great intentions and loving intentions for me, because it actually thought the pain in my thighs, I'd use the end of my toothpaste, the pain in my thighs was actually still less painful than if I was sitting and feeling a child not feeling good enough, because my system was really locked as that 7-year-old little girl. So when we talk about how difficult it is to heal from childhood trauma, we have to work in the body, so that rather than remember it, rather than reliving those events and then feeling activated in the present, we need to almost timestamp them in the hippocampus into the past. So yes, we can look back at our childhood and say, whoa, you know, that happened, or my goodness, that was horrendous what happened to me as well. But we recognize that in this moment, in this time, right now, in this present moment, we are now safe, and it is a long-term memory and it's in the past. And to do that, we have to reconsolidate that memory. So it's not a case of erasing what has happened to people, it's changing the experience of what happened to you. So now when I remember about my childhood, I look back and understand that my dad was only parenting me to his capabilities. It actually had nothing to do with me not being good enough. Now that doesn't mean when I look back, I don't feel some sadness that my dad didn't praise me and you know, give me some validation, because he still hasn't. I'm 48 now and he still hasn't done that. But I no longer see that he's not doing that because I'm not good enough. I understand he's not doing that because he wasn't capable of that because of his own childhood trauma.
Right. Yeah. And that's so key to really connect the dots with our parents. If our parents were the people that, right, we had the experience of trauma with in whatever form. Yeah. Like gaining a better understanding of them. And I love what you just said. Like I wrote this down, right? It's not about erasing the trauma. It's about changing the experience of it. That's so right. That's respecting that we had the experience. And yet at the same time, we can now look at it in a different way than when.
Yeah. And we call that integration. So we integrate what has happened to us in our past, to recognize that we're now safe in the future. You know, every time that we feel activated in our body and we move into that fight, flight, or freeze, that comes from, in the present moment, our perception of danger. Now, very often we are still safe in that present moment, but there's something, and normally it's somebody else's behavior, it might be a smell, it might be a sound, that is taking us back to where our system felt it was really, really painful. So then we'd have all of these protector parts coming up then to try and distract, soothe, minimize away from that. This is where things like addiction comes in, dissociation, procrastination. You know, there's a whole host of protector parts that can show up for us. There's no one size fits all. It's just what our system thinks. It's trying to move us away. But we often feel as adults so much shame in our behavior because we kind of think and know it's in the past and we know that we're an adult now, but we just seem to not be able to move past it. And that's because we need to work in the body, and we have to use certain techniques and different types of therapies that to really work on that deep somatic level. So yes, work on those symptoms of managing those triggers in that moment,